You've probably seen some of the news reports in recent weeks touting trends that seem to indicate progressive faith is on track to outstrip the religious right in this country. These reports stem from a comprehensive new survey published in July by the Public Religion Research Institute in partnership with the Brookings Institution. The Economic Values Survey that inspired that coverage actually covers much wider ground and is full of fascinating insights on the diverse views of various subgroups that Americans fall into. Here to talk about the key findings of this substantial survey is our friend Dr. Robert P. Jones, CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. Robbie, welcome back to State of Belief Radio.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
After the headlines that suggest you found progressive faith heading toward majority status in the country, and is that an oversimplification of your survey results?
Well, this is a snapshot in time, and I guess, as a social scientist, you always want to say that thing that I think you read sometimes on your retirement portfolio that says, present performance is no guarantee of future returns. And I think the same thing sort of applies here with this survey. What I think caused a lot of stir is that what we found is when we mapped out a kind of religious orientation scale that divided Americans into religious progressives, religious moderates, religious conservatives, and the non-religious. And when we broke that out by generation, we found a pretty striking pattern. And the basic findings there are that with each successively younger generation, the appeal of religious conservatism goes down. In other words, so there's a kind of straight linear correlation between age and religious conservatism. So just to give you an example, among the oldest Americans, those age 66 and older, which we call the silent generation in the report, half, 47%, are religious conservatives. Only 12% are religious progressives. But we get a very different picture when we go down to look at 18 to 33-year-olds, the millennial generation, the youngest generation in America. They're only 17% of millennials are religious conservatives. 23% of millennials are religious progressives, and it's worth saying an additional 22% of millennials are non-religious.
Now, probably that I'm going to ask this question, but how do you define a religious progressive?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we wanted to do was to be sure that we weren't just doing a political scale with a religious veneer or only a theological scale with a political veneer. So what we tried to do and what we did in the survey is we actually built a composite scale out of a number of questions that took into account people's views on social issues such as abortion or same-sex marriage. It also took into account people's economic views, so raising the minimum wage, healthcare reform, also the role of government in society. And then it also built in a kind of theological scale as well. So it was the mix of all three of those things that allowed us to classify people along this continuum.
Did you ask about the Bible?
We did. We asked one of the theological questions we asked was about a literal versus a non-literal approach to the Bible. We also asked about a personal versus an impersonal view of God. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of questions that I think are pretty good sorters of people along a theological spectrum.
What are the biggest differences in values that you saw expressed by religious conservatives versus religious progressives? One particularly stark difference I see right away is in the area of who sees good works as being the most important expression of faith as opposed to who emphasizes faith itself as most important.
Yeah. Well, this debate, as you know, is very, very old, certainly in Christian circles. It goes all the way back to the biblical text. We have Paul seeming to tell Christians in the New Testament that it's by faith, not works, that you were saved. And then we have James, the book of James, weighing in on the other side, saying faith without works is dead, right? And so it's led to this kind of debate. And we actually decided, as far as I know, this is the first time we wrote this question new for this poll to try to sort out what Americans thought. It turns out this debate is alive and well in the country today, and you see it playing out among religious progressives and conservatives. So, for example, nearly 8 in 10 of religious progressives say that being a religious person is primarily about doing the right thing. And by contrast, a majority of religious conservatives, 54%, say no. On the contrary, it is about having the right beliefs. So we see this divide showing up, even today among Christians in the U.S.
Now, is that one where the young and old divide as you would expect them to on it?
There are some age differences, and this is actually points to the thing I mentioned earlier, that I think because religious progressives have a larger cohort of younger people in their ranks, a number of attributes that younger people have come along for the ride, really, and this is one of them, that younger people are, in fact, yes, more likely to say it's about doing the right thing than having right beliefs or orthodox beliefs.
Robbie, you cover so much ground in the survey. I've just got to ask a general question. What are some of the other headline findings?
Well, we also found, very interestingly, among the general population, that while it's not a surprise that most people think, the government is not working that well. That's kind of old news, and it confirms what we've seen. But we also found a fair number of people who say that they thought that capitalism was not working that well. And we sharpened the question up and asked specifically a values question and a religion question that was whether capitalism and Christianity were compatible with one another, or whether capitalism was compatible with Christian values. Turns out the country's fairly divided on this question, and that division cuts across religious groups. So even evangelicals are fairly divided on this question, which tend to be more conservative, more free market, supportive of free market capitalism. But on this question, when you really put the question very pointedly about the compatibility between capitalism and Christian values, there's some real reticence, I think, among a significant portion of Americans to wholly embrace, capitalism as an expression of Christianity.
Yeah. Were there other generational differences that stood out?
I guess the other sort of things that we found in the survey is a somewhat depressing pessimism among really young people in particular, but really it cuts across generations. Younger people both said that they thought they were less likely to be better off than their parents were economically, and even when they looked ahead to their own children in the future, thought they would be better off than their children. So a very not optimistic view of the future, and we in fact found that the oldest Americans were really the only generation who had a more optimistic view on the economic front. So we found a real generational divide in terms of evaluating economic prospects going into the future.
Knowing that conservative Christians have aligned a good bit with the Tea Party type conservatives, I'm curious if you saw any correlation regarding trust in government and religious orientation.
Right. So one thing about the Tea Party is really interesting here. I'll get to that question. That, a few years ago we found a significant overlap between the Tea Party and the Christian right, which made a number of headlines because it went against the conventional wisdom at the time that said that the Tea Party was mostly libertarians and not social conservatives. I mean, over the last 3 years, we've consistently found that those who identify with the Tea Party are social conservatives as well as economic conservatives. And this survey really turns out it confirms that. So if we look at the breakdown of the Tea Party in terms of their religious orientation, 6 in 10 of the Tea Party are religious conservatives, right? Not a big surprise probably to your listeners or whatever, but I think still confirms something of we didn't see a lot of libertarianism among the Tea Party crowd. We saw really religious conservatism, social conservatism, economic conservatism, just across the board conservatives in the Tea Party and the Tea Party folks. Now, one thing we found that certainly religious progressives and religious conservatives have very different views in terms of like what they want the government to do. They have very different views about what individual responsibility is. One, I think, really compelling question that gets to the role of individuals versus the role of government is a question that we had about whether or not if people had a better relationship with God, social problems would just take care of themselves, right? Which is a very bottom-up approach. So if individuals get their lives right and hearts right, social problems will really dissipate. And we found there that that among religious conservatives, 82% agree with this statement, right? That this is a very bottom-up approach to solving social problems. only 31% of religious progressives agreed with this statement. So a very different view of how we solve social problems, which, so religious progressives are much more open to sort of structural approaches to solving social problems and structural justice kinds of approaches than religious conservatives, which tend to have a more individualistic, bottom-up approach.
Yeah. Robbie, I always ask you about surprises. What surprised you in this survey?
Well, I think what came as a surprise to many people is actually the relative size of religious progressives versus religious conservatives. We've heard a lot about, rightly, the power and influence of the religious conservatives in the country. And what we found, though, is that they make up about 28% of the country, so all religious conservatives together. But what may be surprising is that we also found that nearly 1 in 5 Americans are religious progressives. So 19% of Americans are religious progressives. That number, I think we haven't sort of seen the public influence of that group, and I think it's because unlike the religious conservatives who are very homogeneous, so 7 in 10 religious conservatives are white Christians, right? Exactly. And they're heavily concentrated in the Midwest and the South. So very heterogeneous, very geographically concentrated. One real challenge for religious progressives going forward is the challenge of bringing together a very, very diverse coalition, that ranges from Sikhs and Buddhists and Jews and Hindus and people who are spiritual but not religious, but nonetheless say that that spirituality is important to them, but they aren't formally affiliated. So this is a very broad coalition, and religious progressives are fairly dispersed across the country. So you can't drop into the Southeast and do outreach among one denomination or a handful of denominations and get there. It really is. I think this is one of the conundrums going forward, and I think the real open question. What I think the survey has shown is that there is a significant religious progressive constituency. Yeah. I still think it's an open question of whether this sizable constituency can fashion itself into something akin to a movement. I think that's the open question for the future.
We're just about out of time, but I've got to ask you, is there enough common ground in what you saw to give us any hope, or is the hope all with the younger generation?
Yeah. You mean common ground in general?
Common ground in general.
Yeah. One of the things that we found is that on economic issues, there actually is a fair amount of common ground here. So things like raising the minimum wage, overwhelming support. Majorities of Republicans and Democrats, or majorities of religious conservatives and religious progressives favor raising the minimum wage. So, on some really basic economic issues, 6 in 10, Americans say the government should do more to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, for example. So there are some, I think, basic economic things that that majorities of Americans get behind across the lines that usually divide us. The real challenge here, though, is that the general pattern we saw in the survey was that Americans wanted a number of things like the government to play a role in reducing the gap between the rich and the poor, but they were very skeptical about the government's ability to play that role, the very role that they wanted to play. Yeah.
Dr. Robert P. Jones is CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. The New Economic Values Survey from PRRI, published in partnership with the Brookings Institution, is filled with fascinating insights regarding the diversity of American beliefs and the way those beliefs influence attitudes toward the nation and toward the world. It's well worth your time to read, available at publicreligion.org. Robbie, it's always fun to have you here because we learn and get our minds stretched and know a little bit about what the challenges are. So thanks for doing this and coming to be with us again on State of Belief Radio.
Always honored to be here.